Swords to Plowshares showed me the power of suggestion, mystery, and wonder that a card name could have, even more so when considering its mechanical effects. Whilst maybe not as elegantly intelligible as Giant Growth, often touted as being easy to grasp without knowing any of the rules of the game, the story of this card is told perfectly in its text box. One player loses a creature that poses a threat to the opponent, but pads their own life total by gaining life equal to its power. The threat has turned their sword into a plowshare and contributed to society in the form of life gain. In other words, they've done an Ian McShane and acquired a pacifist Sandor Clegane.
In all my days, I've never seen a man swing an axe like that.
The sequence of language in its name felt a bit too good, or maybe just archaic, to come from the pen of a fantasy writer or game designer, although it didn't ring any bells to me at the time. It actually comes from Scripture, the Book of Isaiah in the Hebrew Bible of Judaism and the Old Testament of Christianity. I quote the King James translation here, simply because its breadth of readership meant it probably had a significant role in helping the phrase into the English idiom. And many people shall go and say, Come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he shall judge among the nations, and shall rebuke many people, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. Isaiah is a cherished prophet in both Judaism, where he is considered the first of the latter prophets, and Christianity, where he is the first major prophet. While the Book of Kings covers the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians and the exile of its people, Isaiah comes after the war, covering the journey of the people of Jerusalem into exile and hopefully towards a more peaceful existence. Maybe I should hand this one over to a pro.
A real celebrity, not some sign-spinning fucking monkey.
This is from the Book of Isaiah in an introduction to the Old Testament by Walter Brueggemann. I'm definitely not an expert in biblical scholarship and not able to read it as critically as something by Colin Barrow or Gayatri Spivak, but wanted to get an academic view of the trajectory of this part of the Bible nonetheless. The Book of Isaiah, in its turn, is a meditation, albeit in complex configuration, about the destiny of Jerusalem into the crisis of exile and the promise of Jerusalem out of exile into new well-being. So the context of the phrase is a historically significant transition from war to peace, but by no means a cut-and-shot one. The people of Jerusalem have found themselves exiled after the sack of their city. The Book of Isaiah represents both the suffering they experienced, as well as the hope that can emerge from that suffering. This is the crucible from which storied verbal pyrotechnics like swords into plowshares and a voice in the wilderness emerge. It's God's judgment that will cause the people fighting wars to beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. The rebuke of a greater power, pushing warmongering folk towards peace to show mercy to their vanquished foes, feels like it was instrumental in the early stages of White's colour philosophy. See, for example, Ari Nye, the former Council of Colours rep for White, discussing White's divine mercy.
Like there's sort of four basic drawbacks for white removal, because white is, in addition to loving justice, white loves mercy. White is sort of the kindest hearted and does not actually want to kill you. They just want you to obey the rules and be a good member of society.
Sure.
So there's four kinds of drawbacks that white removal can have. One is targeting restrictions, right? Either attacking creature or tapped creature, or creature with power 4 or greater. One is reversibility, things like O-ring and banishing light, where conceivably if they spend a card destroying it, then they can get their creature back.
Sure.
One is symmetry, where, okay, it's I cast Shatter the Sky, all our creatures are gone, but
Armageddon.
Yeah, Armageddon. but yeah, cards like Wrath of God
Sure.
that just kill everyone's creatures. Well, that's fair, right? That's just it's.
Yeah.
And then and the last is compensation, right? Cards like Swords to Plowshares or Path to Exile, where it's like, well, I took away your thing, but I'm sorry, so here, have this.
Beast Within.
Yeah, Beast
Famously
Within,
a white
right?
card.
Exactly. Beast Within is actually, we just reprinted that as
Yeah.
generous gift because it is a
While Wrath of God resets all of the warring factions back to naught, invoking the symmetry clause just mentioned, Swords to Plowshares hints at a design after the dust has settled. Not only does it compensate the controller of the removed creature with life points, but with insight into a philosophy of peaceful productivity. The war-peace dichotomy is addressed directly on the 2001 Friday Night Magic promo card, which keeps the original artwork, but introduces a more direct literary version of peace. Peace hath her victories, no less renowned than war. The quote is actually rendered quite terribly on the card. It makes it seem like it's a discrete couplet, when in fact it's half of the first line and half of the second line. The capitalization is very confusing, but we don't need to spend too much time on that here. It comes from Sonnet 16, Cromwell, our chief of men who threw a cloud, composed in 1652 by John Milton. No slouch when it came to biblical scholarship himself, of course. The poem was written when Milton was what we now call a civil servant, trying his damnedest to persuade Cromwell not to establish a national church with state-appointed ministers, as he thought that would impinge on the religious freedom for Protestants that was established during the English Civil War. Whilst I'm fairly sure the designers of the Judge promo did not really care too much about the bureaucratic religious horseshit underlying the poem that they quoted from, it's still worth examining as we try to get a better understanding of the card. The run-on sentence is referring to the work that's still to be done, now that the parliamentarians have won the war. It isn't simply talking about how peace is better than war, which I guess is more the context it's intended in, but how peacetime will create the need to attain potentially more difficult victories than war. In this case, the protection of what Milton considered to be freedom of religion. Regardless of the authorial intent here, a quote from a poem about how grand and apparently monolithic concepts, like peace and war, are permeable and have a tendency to mesh into each other, fits the design perfectly. The first iteration of a game centering around creature combat had a decent amount to say about peace, as it turns out. The card's name does create a certain level of tension with the current vogue of only including in-universe or diegetic flavor text. While many players have lamented the disappearance of quotes from literature and fiction from Magic cards,
I strenuously object. Is that how it works? Objection. Overruled. Oh, no. No, I strenuously object. Oh, wow. Strenuously object, and I should take some time to reconsider.
the very articulate and fulsomely explained line from Mark Rosewater has been that non-diegetic flavor text takes players out of, rather than into, the worlds that are so painstakingly created for them. If I wanted to start a pointless fight with a titan of game design, I'd say when things like ancient Egypt and H.P. Lovecraft are pilfered pretty much wholesale in the world-building process, you might as well grab a bit of Shakespeare while you're down there, but that doesn't really illuminate much. Within Magic's own universe, or without, the many reprints, artworks, and scraps of flavor text give us an idea of the weight such a dense quotation can support. Because they need to convey game rules and an intuitive understanding of what the card does, there is a fair amount of awkward literality in some versions.
I have no son!
Oh, great. We came all this way and it's the wrong guy.
I didn't mean that literally.
Swords to Plowshares is a phrase that's at least partially metaphorical in its original form, but the artwork often tries to awkwardly foist literal sword, literal plowshare, and some kind of actor into the same scene. Nevertheless, the combination of mechanics, artwork, and flavor text sometimes come together to tell interesting stories. At the risk of sounding like an absolute magic boomer, there is a certain sense of wonderment and intrigue, the kind that usually gets filtered out by design committees, in the original artwork. In the foreground, there is someone who once presumably held a sword, although the artist here did not deem it necessary to show the same figure holding a sword back in the day. He is located in a field, harvesting what looks like wheat with what is presumably a scythe. Plowshares are designed to be attached to plows, after all. More interesting is what's happening in the background. There's a barn to the viewer's left, and to the right, a small castle or folly with a barely perceptible figure approaching on horseback. My inference here, which is certainly not the only one, is that the figure has been successfully integrated into peaceful, albeit seemingly feudalistic, society. Swords to Plowshares is ultimately metaphorical in this instance. Hot on the heels of the original artwork comes Swords to Doves, first seen in Ice Age. There is an undeniable charm and beauty to the way a dove is emerging from the sword, or rather the sword transmutes into the dove, being destroyed in the process. This does kind of put my theory of literal versus figurative art in an awkward position, though, since the sword is literal, but the dove clearly isn't. Doves have a wide history of symbolizing peace and prosperity, most accessibly maybe as part of the hawks and doves categories used by the military-industrial complex. Proportionally, we have half a metaphorical card. The flavor text is in a similar vein to the wider context of Milton's poem, in that it tries to describe how the battles of peace can be more difficult than those of war. In the flavor text, too, a more peaceful society is being constructed. The so-called barbarians will not respect us for our military might. They will respect us for our honor. Lucille Fickstutter, leader of the Order of the White Shield. I'd argue that this flavor text is really well written, since it manages to convey both the process of establishing a peaceful post-war society, but also hints at the speaker's psychology. She is aware that the barbarian-citizen divide is a false dichotomy, with the English word for barbarian coming from the Greek barbaros, someone who hailed from outside of Greece and did not speak the same language or follow the same customs as the civilized Greeks, but meat-headed and vaguely colonialist enough to use the jarring imperative they will respect the conquering Order of the White Shields, referring to the respect supposedly owed to her side. In the story of Magic's Ice Age era, Fickstutter's Order of the White Shield would triumph over an army of the undead, commanded by the necromancer Limdul. Maybe they were the good guys in that instance, but Fickstutter's reductive assessment of the barbarians reminds us that the flames of war often smolder underneath apparent states of peace. The biggest issue with this version of the card is probably its legacy. It seems to have started a trend of designers and/or artists. I'm not exactly sure how much freedom the artists are given in how they interpret classic cards like this. Feel compelled to include an actual sword in the artwork. It's surprising given that the original iconic version of the card only has the plowshare side of things, and the phrase itself is not intended literally in the Book of Isaiah, but when it comes to magic cards, swords is swords. Therese Nielsen's version of the card is possibly the most seen one outside of the original, being reprinted in a number of masters and supplemental products after its original issue in Dual Decks, Elspeth vs. Tezzeret. It's one of the most cryptic iterations of the artwork. While it does include a literal sword, the transition to plowshare is nowhere to be seen, nor is there field of battle. Instead, we get a very muscular, somewhat penitent figure in front of what seem to be the demons of war. The flavor text gives us a clue to what's going on. The smallest seed of regret can bloom into redemption. Presumably, the figure in the foreground is someone who's seen the horrors of war and is trying to redeem themselves. The sword is awkwardly straddled across their shoulders, perhaps by way of penance, and mercifully it is not mutating into a plowshare, or hoe, or other over-literalization. The figures in the background seem to be the demons of war, the council of suffering, but I'm sure their depiction supports other interpretations. Further back still, we can see ravens or crows in the background, ill omens whose relation to the figure in the foreground is not clear. Will the figure bearing the sword be integrated into society? The power of this design is that it asks the person looking at it to fill in a lot of the narrative gaps, anchoring the story in their mind. Who is this former warrior, and what is their redemption? This version of the card casts a long shadow, since it's heavily referenced in the Yargle Secret Lair version, issued as part of Happy Yargle Day. Who said game designers can't meme? Yargle carries the sword just as weirdly as the figure in the original, and seems unable to hold the same redemptive ennui in its head. He stood transfixed, able to do nothing but ponder a life of peace and redemption. It was the worst 5 minutes of his life. Up next, we have the infamous Swords to Golf Clubs, debuted as a Judge promo in 2013, but popularized in the first and only Commander Legends set, reprinted plenty of times until the advent of Cloud Swords into Cloud Plowshares. It would be churlish not to appreciate the intent here, to deliver the full story of a sword being turned into a plowshare in the limited real estate of a magic card, but I think the literality gets in the way of the message of the card. Firstly, one should not swing a hoe, i.e. the human-sized version of a plowshare, as one swings a sword, at least if they want to effectively redistribute the soil. The action frames in the middle of the two figures also feel a bit like 90s CGI. The transition from warrior to farmer is elegantly indicated by the change of outfit for the main figure, their armor being replaced with a civilian's garb. The flavor text is cribbed from the previous version of the card. Here we get a more spoon-fed version of the same story. An unfortunate case in point of the card name being forced to be a universe in and of itself, resulting in a redolently symbolic process looking more like a golf swing. 4! The Mystical Archive versions of the card are, like most of the Mystical Archive cards, considered and attractive. For the English language version, we get a warrior transforming a sword into a plowshare. The flavor text gives a nice representation of the minutiae of peace, a peek into the difficulty of rearing crops, where a bad harvest could of course lead to the type of discontent that ferments into war. In true English language Mystical Archive style, the different objects are highlighted and abstracted quite beautifully, but one can't help feeling like the ghost of Swords to Doves is a bit too present. There is a certain weight of irony to a warrior proudly brandishing a hoe, illuminated by the sunlight of peace, that makes for an enduring image, but the designer or artist couldn't resist the chance to include the ghost of a sword leaving the hoe. The hauntology of hyper-nostalgic card design, I guess.
Je voudrais vous demander une chose. Est-ce que vous croyez aux fantômes?
Je ne sais pas, c'est une question difficile. Est-ce qu'on demande d'abord à un fantôme s'il croit aux fantômes? Ici, le fantôme, c'est moi. Dès lors qu'on me demande de jouer mon propre rôle dans un scénario filmique plus ou moins improvisé, j'ai l'impression de laisser parler un fantôme à ma place. Paradoxalement, au lieu de jouer mon propre rôle, je laisse, à mon insu, un fantôme me ventriloquer, c'est-à-dire parler à ma place.
I get my wish in the Japanese language version of the card, where a black armored samurai brandishes a pretty serious looking hoe/plowshare and gives an intense point. The flavor text is, as far as I can work out, a direct translation of the English version, but the artwork succeeds more, in my humble opinion, because it almost nails the irony of having a soldier in their military pomp hoeing a bit of nondescript farmland. The Mischief version of the card, part of their Secret Lair collection, is just loads of swords with lightning bolts coming out of them. Fair play. Okay, it has some flavor text. We shall melt them in the fire. As far as I know, there aren't any other pieces of flavor text describing the process of turning the sword into the plowshare, much less tie that process metaphorically to the dicey territory between war and peace. Nicely done, Mischief. Version of Swords to Plowshares from the Kamigawa manga Secret Lair drop is an instance of the set, or Secret Lair drop, taking precedence over the internal design of the card, which is fair enough. The card was 20 plus years old at the time that Secret Lair was available for purchase, and it's self-defeating to insist that every version of the card should iterate on the same narrow interpretation.
Am I so out of touch? No, it's the children who are wrong.
There's not too much to say on this one beyond its sideways glance at leading by example. The Emperor mentions the real enemy, and not being afraid of monsters I can see, which seem to hint at the difficulty of fighting peaceful or political battles.
To reveal himself.
Out of the spirit of reinventing the card, we get Swords to Plowshares, an artwork and flavor text combination first shown off in the Crimson Vow Commander decks of 2021, and now apparently the go-to reprint of the card, appearing in most of the many eligible Commander decks since then. I'm at a bit of a loss to say anything that isn't covered by the Reddit thread about the new artwork from the time it was first spoiled, but let me try anyway. There is a solitary warrior holding a golden sword. They are presumably the speaker of the flavor text. The arc of my blade has carved a path of light for the peace that will follow. That points back up to the sky and the background of the art, where cloud cavalry transition into cloud oxen pulling plows. There are a lot of comments on how this is a flavor fail, how it misses the mark of depicting threats being pacified, but I think that's part of what it does well. The flavor text sounds like an empty, morally bankrupt politician's doggerel, and the artwork represents this perfectly. The transition of military to social spending exists only in the clouds. Swords to Plowshares is a pipe dream in 2023. For the 30th edition Swords to Plowshares reprint, well, let's just put it like this. Please remember all of the positive things I said about the original depiction of the card at the start of this section, and I'm deeply sorry if it's one of your rares. Unless you're rich and you got the packs comped, you can take it.
You think it's funny to take screenshots of people's NFTs, huh? Property theft is a joke to you. I'll have you know that the blockchain doesn't lie. I own it. Even if you save it, it's my property. You are mad that you don't own the art that I own. Delete that screenshot.
And so, we come to the vaunted Warhammer 40k iteration. In the grim darkness of the far future, Swords to Plowshares is a Leman Russ tank, the workhorse of the Imperium, that has been repurposed to serve as a combine harvester. Its main cannon has been symbolically wrapped up with white cloth, and it has a plowshare attached to its treads. Here, the literality of the plowshare comes in a wider, sensical metaphorical context. The flavor text explains that this intensely optimistic scene is happening on the agri-world Viridia IV, reminding us that this idyll of peacetime is ultimately just a constituent part of a grim, dark, galaxy-spanning war machine. A great idea, beautifully executed. There's not too much more to say about this iteration. On the 40k crossovers, though, there is a fair amount to cover. The IP clash caused a lot of consternation and intrigue, the most perhaps since the Walking Dead Secret Lair first brought another intellectual property onto Magic cards. Warhammer 40k was indeed the first non-Magic IP to get a full set of commander decks. The two IPs do seem meant to be, although that judgment's probably clouded by how brilliantly executed the 40k universe was in the flavour and mechanics of the decks themselves. The usual doomsday predictions came in, which of course said more about their utterers than they did about the game or the crossover itself. What isn't controversial, at least the way that I see things, is that the IP crossovers contradict the rationale for removing the literary quotes that we discussed earlier, that non-magic worlds on magic cards pull the player out of the world that's been created for them, rather than into it. An elf with a bow probably isn't going toe-to-toe with a Space Marine, a Astartes warrior rocking a bolt gun. So if we can indeed have elves fighting Space Marines in fully sanctioned and legit commander games, then goddammit, I want the odd redolent but not quite fully contextualized reference to the English Civil War on my commander staples. An interesting solution to this multiverse stacking has been raised by the good folks of Reddit. One of the 40k threads on REDH has a lot of people planning to keep the 4 40k decks as discrete entities, only to be played against each other and kept separate from the Magic universe. The increasing number of iterations on cards like Swords to Plowshares allow the designs to move past "we must clearly explain exactly what this card does" and towards a realization of the metaphor in particular worlds and contexts. I think this is ultimately positive for the game and for the minds of its players. There is an absolute glut of Magic and particularly Commander content nowadays. Shout out to the Command Zone for popularizing the style and ultimately the format. It's kind of a trip to listen to their early episodes where Commander is this fringe format that gets no love. The vast majority of this content is incredibly facile and focused on cards which are apparently busted in what is ultimately a non-competitive format. There is a relentless focus on the mechanics of the cards which hinders the imagination of new players and brewers. The wonder of this newly popular version of Magic is that decks can be tailored to goals beyond optimum mechanical performance. Maybe a new player sees the Lehman Russ Swords to Plowshares and it sparks their imagination for a pacifism-based deck. Or a card like Robber of the Rich gives them the spark of a benevolent theft deck. Or maybe something a bit more proactive.
Enrique Duran is a 40-year-old Spanish activist who robbed banks by taking out dozens of loans totaling more than $500,000, never intending to pay them back.
It's the IP crossovers, at least to me, that fuel player creativity more than the clout-chasing fan content. It took an authorized and fully monetized trip to a universe beyond Magic's to unleash the creative potential of this storied biblical phrase. Cosmic indeed, when the IP crossover unshackled the designers from the parasitic and navel-gazing multiverse, we finally got a less literal and more sensical imagining of the card. Where else but the Imperium of Man could peace and war intermingle so ambiguously? Thank you very much for your time and attention on this video. There are a lot of videos out there and I'm grateful for anyone who's interested in mine. If you could do the algorithm stuff like liking and subscribing, that would help me a lot. While I don't compete on the quality of writing or ideas, I am forced to compete on monetary and temporal resources, so grassroots support is much appreciated. Cheers.